There is a moment. Most people have lived it, though they may not have marked it. When someone you love has just finished speaking, and the room holds what they said for a breath or two before you answer. You don't answer immediately, not because you are searching for words, because the words that just entered the air seem to require something from the silence around them before they can be fully heard. The silence is not a pause in the conversation. It is part of it. Something is being said in it. You can feel that. What you cannot quite say is what. And then, because one of you moves to close it, a word, a small sound, a reach for a cup, the gap closes, life continues. But the question that was living in that silence, the question the silence was holding, goes unanswered. Not because it was unanswerable, because we stopped listening before it could finish asking itself. Begin with the Greeks, not the whole of them. Begin with one problem they could not stop thinking about, which was the problem of form. The poets who composed in hexameter, Homer among them, though the tradition runs deeper than any single name, were working inside a constraint so old its origins are lost. 6 metrical feet to a line, and inside that line, built into its architecture, a mandatory cut, a place where the breath stops. The Greeks called it the tomos, the cut. Latin would later name it the Caesura, from caedere, to strike, to divide. The silence was not optional, it was structural. You could not write the line without it. What the poets understood, what the tradition encoded before anyone had articulated it as theory, was that meaning is not carried by sound alone. Sound needs an edge. A note defines itself against the silence that precedes it, and the silence that follows. A word lands differently when it falls into a gap than when it is swallowed by the next word coming. The Caesura did not interrupt the line. It was the mechanism by which the line could be heard. The same instinct shows up in Western music. By the 13th century, mensural notation gave the rest its own glyph. The rest was not the absence of the note, but its own kind of mark, placed on the staff with equal care. A Bach fermata is not a weight. It is an instruction to hold the silence as long as the music has been earning it. A Mozart grand pause, general pause, written into the score, was a moment the performers were required to give back to the room. The notation was telling them, the gap is part of the piece. Play it. This is what the Western tradition, at its most careful, understood about silence. It is not the absence of form. It is form's necessary condition. The Japanese character Jian is red ma. It is made of 2 elements, a gate, and inside the gate, the moon, which is to say, the gap through which something luminous is visible. The character itself is doing what the concept describes. The Greeks arrived at the necessity of the gap by thinking about form, about what a line of verse requires in order to be heard. The Japanese arrived at the same place by thinking about something prior to form. The nature of interval itself, ma, is not a device inside a structure. It is the condition that makes structure possible. It is not the pause between 2 sounds. It is the space in which sounds become related to one another. Without ma, there are no 2 things, only an undifferentiated stream that the mind cannot hold. Sen no Rikyū, who codified the practice of the tea ceremony in the 16th century, understood this not as a philosophical position, but as a practical one. The path to the tea room, the roji, the dewy ground, was designed to take longer than necessary. The guest would walk it slowly, pausing at the stone basin to wash hands, pausing again before the low entrance. These were not delays before the ceremony. They were the ceremony beginning. The silence of the path was the first instruction, and what it instructed was, arrive at yourself before you arrive at the room. Inside the room, Rikyū prescribed a silence between the host's act of scooping water and the act of pouring it. Not a long silence, a breath, perhaps 2. But it was not incidental, and it was not permitted to be filled. That interval was load-bearing. It separated the gesture of preparation from the gesture of offering, and in separating them, it made both legible. A tea ceremony performed without those silences would not be a faster tea ceremony. It would be a series of tasks, The MR was what made it a ceremony at all. Toru Takemitsu, the composer who spent his career thinking about exactly this problem, put it plainly in his essays. A single sound only becomes music when set against the ma around it. He was not speaking metaphorically. He meant that sound, in isolation, is merely acoustic. It becomes expressive. It becomes heard. Only when the silence around it gives it an edge. The Greeks built the gap into the line because the line required it. The Japanese built the gap into everything. Into the garden path, into the tea room, into the architecture of a house where the threshold between inside and outside is not a wall, but a gradation. Not because the form required it, because they understood the gap as the medium in which meaning moves. The West said, silence is part of the form. Japan said, silence is part of the world. The distance between those two sentences is not a matter of emphasis. The Greek tradition and the Western tradition that inherited it understood the gap as something that serves the form. The Caesura earns its place by what it does to the line around it. The rest in the score is justified by the notes it separates. Silence, in this accounting, is always in relation to something. It is purposive, it has a job, and because it has a job, it can be evaluated. A Caesura is well placed or poorly placed, a fermata held too long or released too soon. The gap is real, but it is real the way a joint is real. It exists to hold two things together. The Japanese tradition, and Takemitsu, and Rikyū, and the long line of thought behind them, understood the gap as something prior to the form. Ma is not in service of the music. The music is, in some sense, a disturbance of the MR. The silence is not between the sounds. The sounds are events inside the silence. This is not merely a different emphasis. It is a different ontology, and it cannot be folded into the Western view without losing the thing that made it strange. But here is what neither view quite holds: the experience of the person inside the gap, not the poet constructing the line, not the composer notating the rest, not the tea master prescribing the interval, the person who simply finds themselves in a silence they did not choose, after a loss, after a sentence that landed too heavily, after the music stops and the room has not yet decided what it is without it. The West says the gap is where form does its work. Japan says the gap is where the world breathes. Both are describing something real. Neither is describing the thing you feel when the silence holds something you cannot ask it to give back. Go back to that room. The person who has just finished speaking. The silence that opened after their last word, and that you, or someone, moved to close. What was in it is still there.